In June 2023, a British man was stopped by US border officers at Atlanta airport. He was not carrying drugs. He was not wanted at the time. But when officers examined his mobile phone, they uncovered messages detailing the supply of at least 52 kilograms of cocaine in just 15 days. Those messages did not describe street-level dealing. They outlined a wholesale supply operation feeding organized drug networks in South London. Deliveries, quantities, prices, and instructions were recorded in plain language, tied to real locations and real people. The phone belonged to Joshua Bromwell, a 34-year-old man from Harrietsham in Kent. To people around him, Bromwell claimed he was a music producer earning a modest income. In reality, investigators would later prove that he was coordinating large-scale cocaine distribution, working with gangs linked to serious violence. What makes this case significant is not only the volume of drugs involved, but how it was uncovered. Evidence gathered from encrypted phones, mainstream messaging apps, and international law enforcement cooperation would be used to reconstruct Bromwell's network step by step. This is the documented account of how that operation worked, how investigators traced its reach, and how a sequence of recorded decisions led to a 20-year prison sentence. If you follow this case to understand how networks like this are actually exposed, subscribing ensures you don't miss the investigations that connect one collapse to the next. Harrietsham is a small village in Kent, surrounded by farmland and residential streets. It is not known for organized crime, and it does not feature in crime statistics linked to large-scale drug distribution. For most residents, it is a place associated with routine, privacy, and distance from London's criminal networks. Kent, however, occupies a different position when viewed through the lens of law enforcement. Its road networks, proximity to major ports, and direct transport links to the capital have long made it a transit county for drugs entering and moving across the south of England. From Kent, supply routes run quickly into South London. Areas such as Stockwell and the Oval sit within minutes of major arterial roads, allowing controlled substances to be distributed efficiently into established street-level networks. Between 2020 and 2023, cocaine distribution in South London followed a defined structure. Wholesale quantities were sourced, transported, and delivered through organized chains rather than isolated transactions. These networks were linked to groups already known to police for violence involving weapons, including knives and firearms. Within this environment, individuals operating at the supply level did not draw attention through appearance or behavior. Joshua Bromwell did not present as a trafficker. At the time he was identified by authorities, he was 34 years old and living in Harrietsham, Kent. It is a small village where residents are largely unconnected to organized crime, and where Bromwell did not stand out as a figure of concern. Public information about his early life is limited. There is no reporting that links him to known criminal families, gang environments, or prior notoriety. He was not publicly associated with violence, nor known locally for drug activity. Bromwell described himself as self-employed, working as a music producer. His declared income was modest, and his outward lifestyle did not immediately contradict that claim. He did not live in London, and he did not operate in areas typically associated with open drug markets. His residence in rural Kent placed physical distance between him and the neighborhoods where drugs were later shown to circulate. That distance shaped how he was perceived, as someone removed from the environments most commonly linked to organized supply. Within his community, there is no public record of complaints, arrests, or incidents that would have drawn early attention. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, private, and unremarkable. That outward normality forms the context for what follows. Bromwell presented himself as a struggling creative. He told people he was trying to establish himself as a music producer, working independently and earning modestly. There was nothing about that claim, on its own, that attracted attention. Away from public view, his activity followed a different path. From March to June 2020, Bromwell used an encrypted communications platform known as EncroChat. Operating under the username Carlito, he communicated with contacts involved in the supply of cocaine at kilogram level. The messages did not suggest hesitation or uncertainty. They showed familiarity with quantities, pricing, and delivery expectations. This was not a brief or exploratory phase. The volume discussed and the consistency of contact indicate that Bromwell already understood how wholesale supply functioned and where he sat within it. At the same time, his declared financial position remained unchanged. Official records showed an annual income of approximately £18,000. There was no documented legitimate activity capable of supporting anything beyond a basic standard of living. As time passed, the contrast between income and possessions became more apparent. High-value watches, designer clothing, and expensive electronics entered his life gradually, without explanation. These were not sudden acquisitions, but indicators of sustained access to money that did not align with his stated work. This is the point where most people ask a simple question: how does someone believe this will remain unnoticed? If stories like this make you reassess how close organized crime can sit to ordinary life, liking the video helps ensure these cases continue to be examined in detail. Bromwell did not reduce his involvement as the risks increased. His activity expanded, his confidence remained steady, and his role continued to move further from the margins and closer to the center of supply. The supply operation followed a consistent structure. Cocaine was moved in wholesale quantities, commonly in 3-kilogram loads, transported from outside London and delivered directly into South London. Stockwell and the Oval were among the locations supplied, areas with existing drug markets and established criminal control. These deliveries were not made to independent dealers. They were made to organized groups responsible for storing, dividing, and redistributing cocaine across multiple streets and estates. Violence was a routine feature of these networks. Enforcement of territory relied on intimidation, knife crime, and access to firearms. One of the groups supplied was the London Fields Gang, who operated primarily in East London and had been active for years in drug distribution at scale. Members were linked to the supply of Class A drugs, armed violence, and territorial disputes. Police intelligence connected the group to shootings, stabbings, and the use of fear to maintain control over drug markets. Supplying this gang placed Bromwell's operation at a level where disruption could affect entire boroughs. For a wholesaler, supplying a group like London Fields carried both reward and risk. The demand was constant, the money reliable, but failure or disruption could lead to immediate retaliation. Control of supply meant leverage. Deciding who received product, how often, and in what quantities. At this point, Bromwell's role was no longer passive. He was not reacting to requests. He was managing distribution, maintaining relationships, and ensuring continuity across multiple locations. When encrypted communication platforms such as EncroChat were compromised across Europe, many networks stalled or collapsed. Bromwell did neither. He changed his method of communication and continued operating. By 2023, his coordination had shifted to a mainstream messaging application. Conversations later recovered showed that the scale of supply remained consistent. There was no reduction in volume and no indication of caution in language. The expectation was that the operation would continue without interruption. That expectation followed him across borders. In June 2023, Bromwell arrived in the United States. At Atlanta Airport, he was stopped by US border officers. The stop was routine. He was not flagged as a drug courier. He was not carrying controlled substances. There was nothing in his luggage to suggest criminal activity. The focus turned to his mobile phone. What officers found was not speculation or inference. It was written communication. Messages detailed quantities of cocaine supplied, timing of deliveries, and coordination with multiple contacts. Over a 15-day period, the messages referenced at least 52 kilograms of cocaine moving through established routes. This was not a single transaction. It was sustained supply. If this moment stands out to you, share this video. This is the part most people never see: how an ordinary airport stop exposed a supply chain supporting drug markets across London. Those messages did not remain isolated evidence. They were preserved, shared with UK authorities, and they would soon connect activity in Kent, London, and beyond. By the time US authorities examined Bromwell's phone, UK investigators already held partial intelligence. Data recovered from EncroChat in 2020 had identified a user operating under the handle Asacolito, linked to kilogram-level cocaine supply into London. Surveillance and background analysis had established contact networks, delivery areas, and patterns of communication. What was missing was continuity. That changed when US authorities shared the WhatsApp data recovered at Atlanta Airport. The messages provided recent, time-stamped evidence of ongoing supply activity in 2023. They confirmed that the same individual identified in earlier encrypted communications had continued operating after international takedowns of encrypted platforms. Investigators compared the WhatsApp messages with earlier EncroChat data. The language, Contacts and operational structure matched. Locations referenced in messages aligned with known distribution areas. Quantities discussed were consistent with wholesale supply rather than retail dealing. At this stage, the investigation moved from intelligence gathering to evidence consolidation. Each message was logged, attributed, and placed into a timeline. Financial analysis was conducted alongside communications review to assess income against expenditure. The contrast was clear. Bromwell's declared earnings did not account for the volume of activity recorded or the assets later identified. As the dataset grew, the margin for uncertainty narrowed. Messages that had once been sent under the assumption of privacy were now fixed records. Instructions, confirmations, and acknowledgements became traceable actions. Bromwell was not aware that the material recovered in the United States had been passed to UK authorities. He continued to live and operate without visible change, while investigators completed their analysis and prepared the next phase. The process was deliberate. Speed was secondary to accuracy. When action came, it would be based on documentation rather than assumption. September 2023. In the early hours of the morning, officers executed a planned arrest at Joshua Bromwell's home in Harrietsham, Kent. The operation was coordinated and unannounced. Bromwell was taken into custody without incident. A search of the property followed immediately. Officers recovered multiple luxury wristwatches, high-value designer clothing, and electronic devices, including mobile phones and data storage equipment. The items were catalogued and seized. No legitimate income source was identified that could account for their value. Financial records were examined alongside the seized property. The disparity between Bromwell's declared earnings and his possessions was documented and added to the case file. Digital devices were secured for forensic analysis. Messages, contact lists, and stored data were preserved in accordance with evidence handling procedures. Bromwell was formally charged with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, relating to large-scale cocaine distribution. The charges reflected sustained activity over an extended period rather than isolated transactions. He was remanded following his initial court appearance. This was not treated as an error in judgment or a one-off offense. The material recovered supported a consistent pattern of conduct tied to organized supply. The case moved forward on the strength of documented communications, financial inconsistency, and established links to distribution networks. Croydon Crown Court. Joshua Bromwell stood trial on 2 counts of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The prosecution case was built on recovered communications, financial analysis, and seized property. The court heard evidence spanning multiple years, covering activity before and after the collapse of encrypted communication platforms. Jurors were shown message logs from EncroChat and WhatsApp. The content detailed quantities, timing, and coordination of cocaine supply at kilogram level. Messages were attributed directly to Bromwell through device analysis and account linkage. Locations referenced aligned with known distribution areas in South and East London. Financial evidence was presented alongside the communications. Prosecutors demonstrated that Bromwell's declared income bore no relation to the scale of activity described in the messages or the value of assets recovered from his home. The court was told there was no legitimate business capable of supporting the expenditure identified. The defense challenged attribution and intent. Those arguments were rejected. After deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. On November 21, 2025, the court passed the sentence. Joshua Bromwell was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. In sentencing remarks, the prosecution stated, "This was not a street-level operation. This was wholesale supply, feeding organized criminal networks and sustaining serious violence across London." The court accepted that Bromwell occupied a senior position within the supply chain and that the scale of harm extended beyond individual transactions. The sentence reflected volume, duration, and impact. The case concluded with Bromwell being led from the dock to begin a 2-decade custodial term. Bromwell's conviction removed a key organizer from the supply chain. Distribution routes into South London were interrupted. Ongoing cases linked to his communications continued through the courts. Several associates identified in the EncroChat and WhatsApp material remained under investigation or faced separate prosecutions. The case demonstrated how modern drug supply operated across borders. Planning took place in the UK. Devices traveled internationally. Evidence was recovered outside the country that ultimately secured a domestic conviction. One phone stopped at a US airport connected directly to a network in London. The investigation also marked a shift in enforcement. Encrypted platforms were no longer a guarantee of privacy. Mainstream apps offered no protection once accounts were tied to real-world identities. Do you think 20 years was justice, or only the beginning of accountability? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this matter to you, or not as spectacle, but as a record of how power is built, protected, and eventually exposed, subscribe to the channel. Because every case we document leaves behind evidence, unanswered questions, and consequences that don't end with the sentence.